Emma Thompson thought she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Standing in the rain with just $12 to her name, facing eviction in 29 days, she was about to spend more than half her remaining money on a stranger. The homeless man sitting on a hospital steps looked harmless enough, but Emma had her own problems. Student loans crushing her spirit, working 16-hour shifts just to survive, and now a formal reprimand threatening her nursing career. But something about this man was different. The way he spoke, the intelligence in his eyes, the careful way he asked questions about her life. He claimed he used to be someone important before he lost everything to people he trusted. What Emma didn't know was that her simple act of kindness was about to trigger a chain of events that would expose a criminal conspiracy, destroy a powerful family empire, and change her life forever. Because the man shivering in those torn clothes wasn't who he appeared to be. And the Ferrari that would show up outside her apartment the next morning would bring with it a truth so shocking, so unbelievable, that it would test everything Emma thought she knew about justice, revenge, and the true cost of compassion. Some acts of kindness echo through eternity. Others start wars. This is the story of a $7 meal that sent a man to prison for 25 years and proved that sometimes the people who seem to have nothing are actually the ones with the power to change everything. The only question is, when kindness becomes dangerous, how far are you willing to go to do what's right? Emma Thompson stared at the crumpled eviction notice in her trembling hands, the fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital casting harsh shadows across her exhausted face. 28 years old, and this was what her life had become. The paper felt heavier than it should have for something so thin. 3 months behind on rent. The landlord had finally run out of patience. She stuffed the notice into her worn scrubs pocket and glanced at the clock on the hospital wall. 6:47 a.m. Her 16-hour shift was finally over, but her body felt like it had been run over by a truck. Every muscle ached, every joint protested as she gathered her things from the nurse's station. The other nurses were already talking about their weekend plans, their voices a distant buzz in Emma's tired mind. "You okay, Emma?" asked Jessica, one of the day shift nurses who was just arriving. "You look like you haven't slept in days." Emma forced a smile, the same practiced expression she had perfected over the past 3 years of working double shifts. "Just tired." "You know how it is." Jessica nodded sympathetically, but Emma could see the concern in her eyes. Everyone at St. Mary's knew about Emma's situation. The student loans that kept her chained to this place, working nights and picking up every overtime shift available. $80,000 in debt from nursing school, and it felt like she was drowning in quicksand, sinking deeper no matter how hard she fought. She walked through the hospital corridors, her white sneakers squeaking against the polished linoleum. The smell of disinfectant and desperation hung in the air like a permanent fog. This place had become her second home, more familiar than her tiny studio apartment across town. She knew every corner, every crack in the wall, every sound the old building made during the quiet hours of the night. The automatic doors swooshed open as she stepped into the morning air. October in Chicago was unforgiving, and the wind cut through her thin jacket like a knife. She pulled her collar up and started the long walk home. The bus fare was $2.50 each way, $5 total. She couldn't afford to waste that money anymore, not when she had $12 left in her wallet and payday was still 4 days away. The rain had started sometime during her shift, a steady drizzle that made everything gray and miserable. Water pooled in the cracks of the sidewalk, reflecting the dim streetlights that were still on despite the approaching dawn. Emma's apartment was 8 blocks away, a journey that would take her past the convenience stores with their bulletproof glass, the pawn shops with their neon signs, and the bus stops where people waited with hollow eyes and worn-down dreams. She had made this walk hundreds of times before, but today felt different. The eviction notice crinkled in her pocket with each step, a constant reminder of how precarious her situation had become. 3 months behind on rent meant $1,500 she didn't have. Her landlord, Mr. Peterson, had been patient at first, understanding even. But patience had its limits, and Emma had reached his. The memory of their conversation yesterday still stung. She had knocked on his door at 7 in the morning, still wearing her scrubs from the night shift, hoping to buy herself another week. Peterson had answered in his bathrobe, his gray hair disheveled, his expression already tired before she even spoke. "Emma, I've been expecting you," he had said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm sorry, but I can't wait any longer. I've got bills too, you know. The mortgage on this building doesn't pay itself." She had tried to explain about the overtime shifts, about the extra hours she was picking up, about how she was so close to catching up. But Peterson had heard it all before, probably from dozens of tenants over the years. He had handed her the eviction notice with apologetic eyes. 30 days to find the money or find somewhere else to live. 30 days. Emma had never felt so alone in her life. The wind picked up as she walked, sending leaves skittering across the wet pavement. She passed a group of construction workers starting their early shift, their hard hats gleaming under the streetlights. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying across the empty street. Emma wondered what it felt like to laugh like that, to find joy in the mundane moments of life. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed, really laughed, without forcing it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her mother in Ohio. "How are you doing, sweetie? Dad and I are thinking about you. Love you." Emma's throat tightened. Her parents had no idea how bad things had gotten. They thought she was living the dream, a registered nurse in the big city, saving lives and making good money. They didn't know about the crushing debt, the impossible hours, the way she had to choose between groceries and electricity some months. They had their own problems, her father's factory job barely covering their mortgage, her mother's part-time work at the diner not enough to make ends meet. She couldn't ask them for help. She wouldn't. The hospital came back into view as she turned a corner, its imposing brick facade looming against the gray sky. Emma realized she had been walking in a circle, lost in her thoughts. She needed to focus, to get home before the rain got worse. But as she approached the main entrance, something made her stop. There, sitting on the concrete steps leading up to the hospital, was a man she had never seen before. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair that hung down to his shoulders and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in months. His clothes were a patchwork of different fabrics and colors, layers upon layers that couldn't quite hide how thin he was underneath. A cardboard sign sat beside him, but Emma couldn't read what it said from this distance. The man was shivering, his whole body trembling as the rain soaked through his makeshift shelter of newspaper and plastic bags. His shoes were held together with duct tape, and Emma could see his toes through the holes in the fabric. He looked up as she approached, and she was struck by his eyes. They were blue, the kind of blue that reminded her of summer skies, and they held an intelligence that seemed at odds with his appearance. "Excuse me," Emma said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Are you okay?" The man looked at her with surprise, as if he wasn't used to people acknowledging his existence. "I'm fine, miss. Just trying to stay dry." His voice was different than she expected. Educated, refined, with a slight accent she couldn't place. Emma looked at his cardboard sign and saw that it simply said hungry in careful block letters. "When did you last eat?" she asked, kneeling down beside him despite the rain soaking through her scrubs. The man hesitated, as if he was calculating whether honesty was worth the risk. "Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe the day before. Time gets a bit fuzzy when you're out here." Emma's heart clenched. She thought about the $12 in her wallet, her last money until payday. She thought about the eviction notice in her pocket, about the ramen noodles waiting for her at home, about the impossible choice between helping someone else and helping herself. "What's your name?" she asked. "William," he said, his voice soft. "William Harrison. And you are?" "Emma Thompson." "I work here," she said, gesturing toward the hospital. "I'm a nurse." William nodded slowly, his eyes studying her face. "A nurse. That's a noble profession. My grandmother was a nurse back during the war. She used to say that nurses were the real heroes, the ones who stayed with people in their darkest moments." Something about the way he spoke made Emma pause. There was a formality to his words, a carefulness that suggested education and breeding. She wondered what had brought him to these steps, what series of events had led him to this moment. "William," she said, making a decision that surprised even her. "Are you hungry right now?" He looked at her with those startling blue eyes, and Emma saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, or hope. "I don't want to be a burden, miss. You look like you've got your own troubles." Emma glanced down at her wrinkled scrubs, at the exhaustion she knew was written across her face. "We all have troubles. But right now, I can help with yours." She stood up, her knees protesting after the long shift. "The hospital cafeteria is still open. They serve breakfast until 8. Would you like me to get you something?" William's eyes widened, and for a moment, Emma thought he might cry. "You would do that? For me?" "Of course," Emma said, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, as if she was the first person to see him as human in a very long time. Maybe it was the memory of her little brother Tommy, who had died in a hospital bed when she was 19, surrounded by nurses who barely looked at him as they went through their routines. "I don't have much money," William said, his voice breaking slightly. "I couldn't pay you back." Emma pulled out her wallet and looked at the $12 inside. It was supposed to last her until Thursday, supposed to cover the bus fare to work and maybe a loaf of bread. But looking at William, shivering in the rain, she knew what she had to do. "You don't need to pay me back," she said. "Just wait here, okay? I'll be right back." She walked back into the hospital, the warmth hitting her like a wall. The cafeteria was at the end of the main corridor, past the gift shop and the information desk. Emma had eaten there countless times during her breaks, usually grabbing whatever was cheapest. The breakfast menu was limited but filling: eggs, bacon, toast, coffee. $7 for a full meal. The cafeteria worker, a middle-aged woman named Rosa who had been there for as long as Emma could remember, looked up as she approached the counter. "Emma, honey, what are you doing here? Your shift ended an hour ago." "I know," Emma said, counting out the money in her wallet. "I need to buy a meal to go." "The full breakfast, please." Rosa raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask questions. She had seen enough in her years of the hospital to know that sometimes people needed to do things that didn't make sense to anyone else. She packed the meal in a foam container: scrambled eggs, 2 pieces of bacon, wheat toast, and a small container of orange juice. "That'll be $7, Rosa said, then paused. "You know what, honey? You look like you could use a break." $6.50. Emma handed over the money, leaving her with $5.50. Enough for bus fare home, nothing more. She walked back outside, the warm container in her hands like a small beacon of hope. William was still there, huddled against the rain, his cardboard sign now completely soaked. He looked up as she approached, and the gratitude in his eyes was almost overwhelming. "Here," Emma said, sitting down beside him on the wet steps. "It's still warm." William took the container with shaking hands, his fingers struggling with the plastic tabs. When he opened it, the smell of bacon and eggs filled the air, and Emma heard his stomach growl audibly. "I don't know what to say," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you doesn't seem like enough." "You don't need to say anything," Emma replied. "Just eat." She watched as he took his first bite, the way his eyes closed in appreciation, the way his entire body seemed to relax. It occurred to her that she was witnessing something sacred, the simple act of hunger being satisfied, of one human being caring for another. "This is delicious," William said between bites. I had forgotten what real food tasted like. They sat in comfortable silence as he ate, the rain creating a rhythm on the hospital's awning above them. Emma found herself studying William's face, noting the way his features seemed refined despite the dirt and wear. His hands, she noticed, were clean despite his circumstances, the nails trimmed and neat. "May I ask you something?" William said, pausing in his meal. "Of course. Why did you help me? Most people, they look right through me like I'm not even there. But you stopped. You saw me." Emma considered the question, thinking about her little brother Tommy, about the nurses who had cared for him in his final days. Some had been kind, gentle, treating him like a person instead of a patient. Others had been efficient but distant, going through the motions without really connecting. "I became a nurse because I wanted to help people," she said finally. "It sounds simple, but it's true. When I was 19, my little brother died in a hospital. He was only 12, leukemia. Some of the nurses there, they were incredible. They made his last days bearable, made him feel like he mattered. But others," she trailed off, the memory still painful after all these years. "Others saw him as just another patient," William finished softly. "Exactly. I promised myself that I would never be that kind of nurse. That I would always see the person, not just the illness or the problem." William nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "And you do that here, at this hospital?" "I try," Emma said. "It's not always easy. The hours are long, the pay is terrible, and sometimes the system makes it hard to really connect with patients. But I keep trying." "What keeps you going?" William asked, his voice curious. "When things get difficult, what makes you keep trying?" Emma thought about the question, about the eviction notice in her pocket, about the crushing debt that followed her everywhere. "I guess I believe that small acts of kindness matter. Even when everything else is falling apart, even when it feels like the world doesn't care, I can still choose to be kind. I can still choose to help. William finished his meal and closed the container carefully, as if he wanted to preserve every bit of warmth it had provided. You know, he said, his voice thoughtful, I've been watching people for a while now. Sitting here, on these steps, you get to see humanity at its most basic level. Most people walk by without a second glance. Some drop $1 or two, but they don't stop, don't really see me. That must be lonely, Emma said. It is, William admitted. But it's also educational. You learn who people really are when they think no one is watching. You learn the difference between performative kindness and genuine compassion. Something in his tone made Emma look at him more carefully. You sound like you've had experience with both. William smiled, and for a moment, Emma caught a glimpse of who he might have been before life brought him to these steps. I have. More than I care to remember. What happened to you? Emma asked gently. How did you end up here? William's expression grew distant, his eyes focused on something far beyond the rain-soaked street. That's a long story, and not a very pleasant one. Let's just say that I learned some hard truths about the people I trusted most. The rain was getting heavier, and Emma realized she should probably head home. Her wet scrubs were clinging to her skin, and she was starting to shiver. But something about William made her reluctant to leave, as if their conversation was important in a way she couldn't quite understand. I should probably go, she said reluctantly. I've been working all night, and I need to get some sleep. William nodded, understanding in his eyes. Of course. Thank you again for the meal, and for treating me like a human being. You have no idea how much that means. Emma stood up, her muscles protesting after sitting on the cold concrete. Will you be okay? Do you have somewhere to go when the rain gets worse? I'll manage, William said with a sad smile. I always do. Emma started to walk away, then turned back. William, I work nights here 4 days a week. If you're ever hungry again, if you need help, just find me. My name is Emma Thompson, and I'm usually at the nurse's station on the 3rd floor. William's eyes lit up with surprise and gratitude. I'll remember that. Emma Thompson, 3rd floor. Thank you. As Emma walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with William had been significant somehow, though she couldn't explain why. There had been something in his eyes, in the way he spoke, that suggested depths she couldn't fathom. He wasn't just another homeless person looking for a handout. He was someone with a story, someone who had fallen from grace and was now observing the world from the bottom. The rain followed her all the way home, soaking through her jacket and chilling her to the bone. By the time she reached her apartment building, she was exhausted and shivering. The lobby smelled like mildew and broken dreams, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead like dying stars. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her studio apartment, her feet heavy with fatigue. The hallway was narrow and poorly lit, with doors that had seen better decades. Her apartment was at the end of the hall, number 3B, with a door that stuck and locks that barely worked. Inside, her apartment was exactly as she had left it 16 hours ago. The Murphy bed was still folded down, unmade sheets tangled from her few hours of restless sleep. The kitchenette was barely big enough for one person, with a mini fridge that hummed constantly and a hot plate that worked when it felt like it. The bathroom was so small she had to step sideways to close the door. But it was home, at least for now. At least until the 30 days were up. Emma changed out of her wet scrubs and into an old t-shirt and sweatpants. She heated up a cup of ramen noodles in the microwave, the sodium-rich broth the poor substitute for real nutrition. As she ate, she thought about William, about the way he had savored every bite of his breakfast, about the gratitude in his eyes. She had spent $7 on his meal, leaving her with $5.50 until payday. It wasn't rational, wasn't practical, wasn't smart. But sitting there in her tiny apartment, eating 49-cent noodles, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. She felt good about herself. For the first time in months, she had done something purely kind, with no expectation of reward or recognition. She had seen someone in need and had acted, despite her own desperate circumstances. It was a small act, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like a victory. Emma finished her noodles and crawled into bed, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. The rain continued to patter against her single window, a steady rhythm that usually helped her sleep. But tonight, her mind was too active, too full of thoughts and questions. She thought about William's refined way of speaking, about the intelligence in his eyes, about the way he had watched people, and made observations about human nature. She thought about his comment about learning hard truths about people he trusted, about the sadness that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fire. Who was he? What had brought him to those hospital steps? And why did she feel like their meeting had been more than just coincidence? As sleep finally began to claim her, Emma made a silent promise to herself. Tomorrow, when she went back to work, she would look for William. She would check on him, make sure he was okay. Maybe she would buy him another meal, if she could afford it. She didn't know it yet, but that simple act of kindness, that $7 breakfast purchased with money she couldn't afford to spend, had set in motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. Outside her window, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean and preparing the world for whatever tomorrow might bring. Emma slept for 4 hours before her alarm dragged her back to consciousness. The rain had stopped, but the gray clouds still hung low over the city like a heavy blanket. She moved through her morning routine mechanically: shower, coffee, the same wrinkled scrubs she had worn yesterday. The eviction notice sat on her tiny kitchen table, a constant reminder of the countdown that had begun. 29 days left. She walked to work again, the $5.50 in her wallet not enough for bus fare both ways. The streets looked different in daylight, less threatening but somehow more depressing. The puddles reflected a world that seemed permanently overcast, as if the sun had forgotten about this part of the city. When she arrived at St. Mary's Hospital, Emma found herself looking for William before she even realized what she was doing. The steps where he had sat yesterday were empty except for few cigarette butts and a coffee cup that the wind had blown against the concrete. She felt a strange disappointment, as if she had been looking forward to seeing him again. Inside the hospital, the day shift was in full swing. The hallways bustled with activity, doctors making rounds, nurses checking on patients, visitors clutching flowers and worried expressions. Emma made her way to the locker room to store her jacket and check the shift assignments. "Emma, there you are," called Jessica, the same nurse who had expressed concern yesterday morning. "Dr. Patterson is looking for you." Something about the Henderson case from last week. Emma's stomach dropped. Mrs. Henderson had been a difficult patient, demanding and critical of every aspect of her care. She had complained about everything from the temperature of her food to the way Emma had helped her to the bathroom. Emma had tried to remain professional, but by the end of Mrs. Henderson's stay, she had been exhausted and frustrated. "Did he say what it was about?" Emma asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "No, but he seemed serious." "His office is on the second floor, room 214. Emma climbed the stairs to the administrative offices, her mind racing through every interaction she had had with Mrs. Henderson. Had she missed something? Made a mistake? The woman had been so critical, so impossible to please, that Emma had begun to dread entering her room. Dr. Patterson's office was small and cramped, filled with medical journals and patient files. He was a thin man in his 50s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look perpetually worried. He looked up as Emma knocked on the open door. "Miss Thompson, come in. Please, have a seat." Emma sat in the uncomfortable chair across from his desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You wanted to see me about Mrs. Henderson?" "Yes," Dr. Patterson said, shuffling through some papers on his desk. "I received a complaint about your care of her during her stay last week. She claims you were unprofessional, that you ignored her requests for help, and that you were, quote, dismissive and rude." Emma's heart sank. "Dr. Patterson, I tried my best with Mrs. Henderson. She was very demanding, and I did everything I could to accommodate her requests. I was never rude to her." "I'm sure you believe that," Dr. Patterson said, his tone neutral. "But we take patient complaints very seriously here. Mrs. Henderson is threatening to file a formal complaint with the state board, and she's considering legal action." "Legal action?" Emma's voice came out as a whisper. "For what?" "She claims you provided substandard care, that you were negligent in your duties." "Now, I don't necessarily believe her claims, but we need to take them seriously. I'm going to have to put a formal reprimand in your file, and you'll need to attend a refresher course on patient relations." Emma stared at him in disbelief. "A reprimand?" "Dr. Patterson, I've been working here for 3 years. I've never had a complaint before. I work double shifts, I cover for other nurses, I do everything asked of me. I know, Ms. Thompson, and that's why this is just a reprimand and not something more serious. But we have to protect the hospital's reputation." "I'm sorry, but my hands are tied." Emma left Dr. Patterson's office feeling like she had been punched in the stomach. A formal reprimand would go on her permanent record, affecting any future job applications. And the patient relations course would cost her a day's pay that she couldn't afford to lose. She spent the rest of her shift in a daze, going through the motions of her job while her mind churned with worry and frustration. Every patient interaction felt fraught with danger now, every request or complaint a potential landmine. She found herself second-guessing every decision, every word, every gesture. It was during her dinner break that she finally remembered William. She had been so preoccupied with her own problems that she had forgotten about checking on him. The cafeteria was busy, filled with hospital staff grabbing quick meals between shifts. Emma bought herself a small salad with the last of her money, then decided to walk outside and see if William was there. The hospital steps were empty, but as she walked around the building, she spotted him sitting on a bench in the small courtyard behind the emergency department. He was reading a newspaper that looked several days old, his lips moving slightly as he read. When he saw her approaching, his face lit up with recognition. "Emma," he said, folding the newspaper carefully. "I was hoping I might see you again. I was looking for you earlier," Emma said, sitting down beside him on the bench. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." William studied her face with those penetrating blue eyes. "You look troubled." "Bad day." Emma was surprised by his perceptiveness. "You could say that. Work stuff. Nothing I can't handle. Would you like to talk about it?" William asked gently. Sometimes it helps to share our burdens with someone who has no stake in the outcome. There was something about his tone, the way he spoke, that made Emma want to confide in him. Maybe it was because he was a stranger, someone outside her world of hospital politics and financial stress. Or maybe it was because he had already seen her at her most vulnerable, buying him food with money she couldn't afford to spend. "I got a formal reprimand today," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "A patient complained about my care, said I was rude and unprofessional." "It's not true, but it doesn't matter. It's going on my permanent record." William frowned, his expression serious. "Tell me about this patient. What was she like?" Emma found herself describing Mrs. Henderson in detail, her constant complaints, her impossible demands, the way she had made Emma feel like nothing she did was good enough. William listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question. "She sounds like a difficult person," William said when Emma finished. "But more than that, she sounds like someone who enjoys exercising power over others, especially those she perceives as being beneath her." "That's exactly what she was like," Emma said, surprised by his insight. "But what can I do?" "She's filed a complaint, and the hospital has to take it seriously." "What do you know about this woman?" William asked. "Her background, her circumstances, her connections?" Emma shrugged. "Not much. She was here for a minor surgery, some kind of cosmetic procedure. She had a private room, expensive clothes, jewelry. She acted like she was used to getting her way." William was quiet for a moment, staring off into the distance. People like that, they're used to intimidating others into compliance. They use their wealth and status as weapons, especially against those they see as powerless. "Well, she's right about me being powerless," Emma said bitterly. "I'm just a nurse with student loans and an eviction notice. She could probably buy and sell me 100 times over." "Don't underestimate yourself," William said firmly. "You have something she doesn't have, something that can't be bought or sold." "What's that?" "Integrity. Compassion. The ability to see people as human beings rather than objects to be manipulated." William turned to face her fully. "Tell me, Emma, why did you become a nurse?" Emma repeated the story she had told him the day before, about her brother Tommy, about the nurses who had cared for him with kindness and those who had treated him like just another patient. "And you've never forgotten that lesson," William said. "You've never stopped trying to be the kind of nurse who sees the person, not just the illness." "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it," Emma admitted. "The pay is terrible, the hours are impossible, and now I'm getting complaints for trying to do my job. Maybe I should have become something else, something easier." "Like what?" Emma thought about it. "I don't know. Business, maybe. Something where I could make real money, where I wouldn't have to worry about rent or student loans." William smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. "Money can solve many problems, Emma, but it can't solve the most important ones. It can't give you purpose or meaning or the satisfaction of knowing you've made a difference in someone's life." "Easy for you to say," Emma said, then immediately regretted the words. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean that." "Don't apologize," William said. "You're right to be skeptical. I haven't always been in this situation, Emma. I've seen both sides of the coin, so to speak. I've had money more than I knew what to do with, and I've had nothing. And I can tell you from experience that the person you are matters far more than the money you have." Emma looked at him curiously. "What did you do?" William hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "I was in business. Technology, mostly. I built something from nothing, created jobs, made what most people would consider a fortune." "What happened?" "I trusted the wrong people," William said simply. "I discovered that the person I loved most in the world, the person I had given everything to, was stealing from me. Not just money, but my company, my reputation, my future. When I confronted him about it, he had me declared mentally incompetent and took control of everything." Emma stared at him in shock. "That's horrible. Couldn't you fight it?" "Get a lawyer." "I tried," William said. "But he was very clever, very thorough. He had doctors who would testify to my mental state, witnesses who would corroborate his story. And I was so devastated by his betrayal that I wasn't thinking clearly. I made mistakes, said things that made his case stronger." "So you lost everything?" "Not everything," William said. "I lost my money, my company, my home. But I gained something else, perspective. When you're stripped of all the trappings of success, you learn who you really are. You learn what matters." Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I can't imagine how that must have felt." "It felt like dying," William admitted. "But it also felt like being born again. When you have nothing left to lose, you're free to be completely honest about who you are and what you believe." They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Emma was trying to process what William had told her, trying to reconcile the refined, intelligent man beside her with the homeless person she had met on the hospital steps. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked finally. "Because I see something in you that reminds me of who I used to be," William said. "Before I became cynical, before I learned that people could be cruel and selfish and manipulative. You still believe in kindness, in doing the right thing even when it costs you." "That's rare, Emma. That's precious." "It doesn't feel precious," Emma said. "It feels naive." "Maybe it is," William agreed. "But naive people are the ones who change the world. They're the ones who refuse to accept that things have to be the way they are." Emma's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and sighed. "My break is over. I have to get back to work." "Of course," William said, standing up as she did. "Thank you for sitting with me. It's been a long time since I've had a real conversation with someone." "What will you do now?" Emma asked. "Where will you go?" "I'll find somewhere to sleep," William said. "There's a shelter about 6 blocks from here. If I get there early enough, I can usually get a bed for the night." Emma felt a pang of guilt. Here she was complaining about her problems, while William was facing the prospect of sleeping in a shelter or on the street. "I wish I could help more," she said. "You've already helped more than you know," William said. "You've reminded me that there are still good people in the world, people who care about others even when they're struggling themselves." As Emma walked back into the hospital, she found herself thinking about William's story. The betrayal he had described sounded almost unbelievable, like something from a movie. But there had been something in his eyes, a depth of pain that couldn't be faked. The rest of her shift passed slowly. She took care of her patients with the same dedication she always had, but the reprimand weighed on her mind. Every interaction felt scrutinized, every decision second-guessed. She found herself being overly polite, almost obsequious, with patients who were demanding or difficult. It was near the end of her shift when she encountered her first real test. Mrs. Rodriguez in room 314 was recovering from hip surgery and had been pressing her call button every 15 minutes for the past 2 hours. Emma had already checked on her 6 times, adjusting her pillows, getting her water, helping her to the bathroom. "Nurse," Mrs. Rodriguez called out as Emma entered the room. "I need you to call my daughter. I've been trying to reach her all day, and she's not answering her phone." Emma glanced at the clock. It was 2:30 a.m. "Mrs. Rodriguez, it's very late. Maybe we should wait until morning to call your daughter." "No," Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. "I need to talk to her now. She's probably at one of those clubs, drinking and carrying on. She needs to know that her mother is in the hospital." Emma took a deep breath, remembering the patient relations course she would have to attend. I understand you're worried about your daughter, but calling her in the middle of the night might not be the best idea. She could be sleeping, or working, or dealing with her own responsibilities. Are you refusing to help me? Mrs. Rodriguez asked, her voice rising. I'm paying good money to be here, and I expect proper service. Emma felt the familiar knot of frustration forming in her stomach. This was exactly the kind of situation that had gotten her in trouble with Mrs. Henderson. She could either stand her ground and risk another complaint, or she could give in to an unreasonable request. Of course, I'm not refusing to help you, Emma said carefully. But I think your daughter would appreciate being contacted at a reasonable hour. What if I help you call her first thing in the morning? Mrs. Rodriguez glared at her. I want to speak to your supervisor. Right now, Emma's heart sank. Another complaint, another potential reprimand. She was about to respond when she heard a commotion in the hallway. Raised voices, the sound of someone arguing with a security guard. I need to see Emma Thompson, a man's voice was saying. It's important. Emma stepped into the hallway and saw a scene that made her blood run cold. A man in an expensive suit was standing near the nurse's station, his face flushed with anger. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and cold eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with calculating precision. Sir, visiting hours are over, the security guard was saying. You'll need to come back tomorrow. I'm not here to visit anyone, the man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to getting his way. I'm here on business. I'm looking for a nurse named Emma Thompson. Emma's legs felt weak. She had no idea who this man was, but something about him radiated danger. She was about to approach when she heard another voice, one that made her freeze in place. Hello, David. William stepped out of the shadows near the elevator bank, and Emma realized with shock that he looked completely different, gone with a ragged clothes and unkempt appearance. He was wearing a clean pair of khakis and a button-down shirt, his hair was combed, and his beard was neatly trimmed. He looked like what he was, a successful businessman who had simply been playing a role. The man in the suit turned around, and Emma saw his face change from anger to something like fear. Dad, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same question, William said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel. What business do you have with Miss Thompson? Emma's mind was reeling. Dad? This angry, dangerous-looking man was William's son, the same son who had betrayed him, who had stolen his company and left him homeless. I'm looking for the woman who's been feeding you, David said, his voice full of disgust. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? The board members are asking questions. The press is starting to sniff around. You're supposed to be in the facility, Dad. You're supposed to be getting treatment. I'm getting exactly the treatment I need, William said. And Miss Thompson has been very kind to me, which is more than I can say for my own son. Emma watched the interaction with growing understanding. William hadn't just been observing people from the hospital steps. He had been testing them, seeing who would show kindness to someone they thought was homeless and powerless. You're making a fool of yourself, David said, his voice rising. And you're making a fool of our family. I've been tracking you for days, watching the security footage, seeing who you've been talking to. This woman, he gestured toward Emma, is she the one you've been meeting with? Her name is Emma Thompson, William said quietly. And she's shown me more genuine kindness in 2 days than you've shown me in 2 years. David's face twisted with rage. Kindness? Dad, she's playing you. Can you see that? She's probably hoping to get money out of you to take advantage of your condition. My condition? William's voice was dangerously quiet. You mean the condition you fabricated to steal my company? I didn't steal anything, David snapped. I protected our assets from your increasingly erratic behavior. The board agreed with me. The doctors agreed with me. You were becoming a liability. Emma felt like she was watching a train wreck in slow motion. The other staff members had gathered around, drawn by the commotion. Patients were peering out of their rooms, and she could see Mrs. Rodriguez in the background, her complaint forgotten in the face of this much more interesting drama. David, William said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had once commanded boardrooms and controlled billions of dollars. I want you to leave. No. And I want you to stay away from Ms. Thompson. She has nothing to do with our family's problems. She has everything to do with it, David shot back. She's been enabling your delusions, feeding into your fantasy that you're some kind of saint living among the poor. Do you know what she does for a living, Dad? She's a nurse. She makes $30,000 a year. She's nobody. Emma felt the words hit her like a physical blow. She had been standing in the background, trying to process what was happening, but David's casual dismissal of her worth stung more than she expected. She's more of a somebody than you'll ever be, William said, his voice filled with quiet fury. She has something you've never had and never will have, a decent human heart. David laughed, a sound devoid of humor. A decent human heart doesn't pay the bills, Dad. It doesn't build companies or create jobs or generate wealth. You taught me that, remember? You taught me that business is about results, not feelings. I taught you wrong, William said simply. And you learned the lesson too well. Emma watched as David's expression shifted from anger to something like calculating coldness. You know what, Dad? You're right. I did learn your lessons. I learned that weak people get crushed, that sentiment is a luxury we can't afford, that the only thing that matters is results. He turned to look at Emma directly for the first time. And you, Ms. Thompson, you think you're so noble, so pure, buying food for homeless people with money you don't have. Do you know what that makes you? Stupid. Financially irresponsible. The kind of person who will never amount to anything because you're too busy trying to save the world to save yourself. Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I'd rather be stupid and kind than smart and cruel, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. David smiled, but it was a cold, predatory expression. Would you? Even when your kindness gets you evicted? Even when your bleeding heart costs you your job? Because that's what's going to happen, you know. People like you, people who can't make the hard choices, they always end up losing everything. That's enough, William said, stepping between David and Emma. You've said your piece. Now leave. I'll leave, David said, straightening his tie. But this isn't over, Dad. I've filed papers to have you committed to a psychiatric facility. The hearing is next week. And when that happens, your little game of playing homeless will be over. He turned to Emma one last time. And you, Ms. Thompson, you might want to think about finding yourself a new job and a new apartment. Because when I'm done cleaning up this mess, anyone who enabled my father's delusions is going to find themselves in a very uncomfortable position. With that, David walked out of the hospital, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. The sound echoed in the sudden silence that followed his departure. Emma stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. In the space of 10 minutes, her entire understanding of her relationship with William had been turned upside down. He wasn't just a homeless man she had helped. He was a billionaire, playing some kind of elaborate game, and she had somehow become a pawn in a family drama that was far beyond her comprehension. Emma, William said softly, turning to face her. I'm sorry you had to see that. Who are you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Who are you really? William looked around at the crowd that had gathered, at the other nurses and staff members who were staring at them with undisguised curiosity. Perhaps we should talk somewhere more private, he said. But Emma was already backing away, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had witnessed. No, she said, her voice growing stronger. I need to think. I need to understand what just happened. She turned and walked quickly toward the staff locker room, her heart pounding and her thoughts spinning out of control. Behind her, she could hear William calling her name, but she didn't stop. She needed space, she needed time, she needed to figure out what this meant for her life. Because if David Harrison was right about one thing, it was that her world was about to change forever. And she had no idea if that change would save her or destroy her. Emma spent the rest of her shift in a fog of confusion and dread. Every time she tried to focus on her patients, her mind drifted back to the confrontation in the hallway. David Harrison's words echoed in her head like a curse. Anyone who enabled my father's delusions is going to find themselves in a very uncomfortable position. She had helped William out of genuine kindness, spending her last $7 on a meal for someone she thought was homeless and hungry. Now she was discovering that her simple act of compassion had somehow entangled her in a web of corporate intrigue and family betrayal that she couldn't begin to understand. When her shift ended at 6 a.m., Emma found herself reluctant to leave the hospital. The familiar routine of patient care, medication schedules, and chart updates felt safe compared to the uncertainty that waited for her outside. But she couldn't hide forever. She gathered her things from the locker room and made her way to the main entrance. William was waiting for her on the steps where she had first found him, but he looked completely different now. He was wearing a well-tailored navy suit, his hair was professionally styled, and his shoes were Italian leather that probably cost more than Emma made in a month. He looked like what he was, a billionaire who had been playing dress-up as a homeless person. "Emma," he said, standing as she approached. "Thank you for stopping. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Emma said, her voice guarded. "I'm still not sure I should be talking to you." "I understand," William said. "You must have a lot of questions." Emma stared at him, trying to reconcile this polished businessman with the shivering homeless man she had bought breakfast for just 2 days ago. "Was any of it real?" she asked. "The hunger, the cold, the gratitude. Was any of it actually real?" William's expression grew pained. "All of it was real, Emma. The hunger, yes. I had been living on the streets for 3 months, eating when I could find food or when someone was kind enough to share. The cold was real. The gratitude was absolutely real. But you're a billionaire," Emma said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "You could have stayed in any hotel, eaten at any restaurant, bought anything you wanted." "Could I?" William asked. "My son had me declared mentally incompetent. He froze my assets, took control of my company, and had me committed to a psychiatric facility. I escaped from that facility 3 months ago and have been living on the streets ever since." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You escaped?" "From a psychiatric facility. I was never mentally ill, Emma. David fabricated evidence, bribed doctors, and convinced a judge that I was suffering from dementia and posed a danger to myself and others. The facility he had me committed to was little more than a prison. I was heavily medicated, kept in isolation, and told that I would spend the rest of my life there." "How did you get out?" William smiled grimly. "I had help from someone on the inside, a nurse who recognized that I wasn't actually mentally ill. She helped me understand David's plan and provided me with a means to escape. But by then, he had already taken everything. My company, my homes, my bank accounts, even my identity. As far as the legal system is concerned, William Harrison Sr. is a mentally incompetent man who belongs in a psychiatric facility." Emma shook her head in disbelief. "This sounds like something out of a movie. People don't just steal entire companies from their own parents. It happens more often than you think," William said. "Elder abuse is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Children and relatives steal from the elderly all the time, often with the blessing of the legal system. They declare their victims incompetent, take control of their assets, and then warehouse them in facilities where they can't fight back. But why live on the streets? Why not get a lawyer, fight the charges, prove your competence?" "I tried," William said. "But David was very thorough. He had my medical records altered, my business associates convinced that I was losing my mind, and enough evidence fabricated to support his claims. Every lawyer I approached told me the same thing. I needed to prove my mental competency before I could challenge his actions, but the system was designed to make that nearly impossible." Emma felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. "So you decided to live homeless and observe people. What was the point of that?" "I was gathering evidence," William said. "David's theft wasn't just about money. It was about power, about proving that he was stronger and smarter than his father. He made enemies in the process, people who would be willing to testify against him if they knew the truth. But more than that, I was trying to understand what kind of person I had raised, what kind of man I had become that I could produce such a son." "And what did you learn?" William's expression grew thoughtful. "I learned that David was right about one thing. I had taught him that business was about results, not feelings. I had created a monster by showing him that success meant crushing anyone who got in your way. But I also learned that there were still good people in the world, people like you who would help a stranger without expecting anything in return." Emma felt a surge of anger. "So I was part of your experiment. You were testing me." "Not testing," William said quickly. "Learning. I had spent so many years surrounded by people who wanted something from me, who showed me kindness only because they hoped to profit from it. When you bought me that meal, when you sat with me and listened to my story, I was reminded of what genuine human compassion looked like." "But you lied to me," Emma said. "You let me think you were homeless and desperate while you were actually a billionaire playing games." "I was homeless," William said. "I was desperate. The fact that I used to have money doesn't change the reality of my situation. I was hungry, cold, and alone. The kindness you showed me was real, and it mattered more than you know." Emma stared at him, trying to process everything he had told her. Your son said he was going to have you committed again. He said there was a hearing next week. He's going to try, William agreed. But I've been preparing for this moment. I've gathered evidence of his embezzlement, his fraud, his abuse of power. I've recorded conversations, documented transactions, and identified witnesses who can testify to his crimes. What does that have to do with me? Emma asked. Why did he threaten me? William's expression grew grim. Because you're a witness to his character. You've seen how he treats people he considers beneath him. You've heard him make threats and display the kind of cruelty that will help prove my case about his unfitness to run my company. I don't want to be involved in your family drama, Emma said firmly. I have my own problems to deal with. I know, William said, and I'm sorry that David involved you. But Emma, you need to understand something. He meant what he said about making your life difficult. He has the resources to follow through on his threats. Emma felt a chill of fear. What do you mean? He could have you fired from your job, make sure you never work as a nurse again. He could pressure your landlord to evict you immediately instead of waiting for the 30-day notice. He could make it very difficult for you to find employment anywhere in the healthcare industry. He can't do that, Emma said, but her voice lacked conviction. He can and he will, William said. David sees anyone who opposes him as an enemy to be destroyed. He doesn't make idle threats. Emma felt her world spinning out of control. What am I supposed to do? I can't fight someone like him. I don't have money for lawyers or connections or power. You have something more valuable than any of those things, William said. You have integrity. You have the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. And you have my support. Your support. Emma laughed bitterly. You're about to be committed to a psychiatric facility. What kind of support can you offer? William reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. David made a mistake by confronting you in public, by making threats in front of witnesses. I recorded the entire conversation. Emma stared at the envelope. What's in there? Evidence, William said. Financial records showing David's embezzlement, medical records proving that I was never mentally ill, testimony from witnesses who can corroborate my story. Everything I need to prove that David is a criminal who stole my company and had me falsely imprisoned. Why are you showing me this? Because I need your help, William said. The hearing is tomorrow, not next week. David lied about that, probably hoping to catch me off guard. I need someone I can trust to deliver this evidence to the judge, someone who could testify to what they witnessed last night. Emma backed away from him. I can't. I won't. I'm not getting involved in this. You're already involved, William said gently. The moment you showed kindness to a stranger, you became part of this story. The question is whether you'll let David destroy you for that kindness, or whether you'll fight back. Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know how to fight someone like him. I'm just a nurse. I don't understand corporate law or family trusts or any of this. You don't need to understand any of that, William said. You just need to tell the truth about what you witnessed. About David's threats, his attitude toward people he considers beneath him, his willingness to destroy anyone who gets in his way. And what happens to me after that? Even if you win, even if you get your company back, David will still hate me. He'll still want revenge. William was quiet for a long moment. Emma, I'm going to tell you something that might change your perspective on the situation. David didn't just steal my company. He stole it from everyone who worked there, everyone who depended on it for their livelihood. Harrison Tech employs 12,000 people. Under David's leadership, the company has been hemorrhaging money, cutting benefits, laying off workers. He's been liquidating assets to fund his lifestyle, selling off divisions that took me decades to build. What are you saying? I'm saying that this isn't just about me or my family. It's about 12,000 families who depend on that company for their survival. It's about the research we were doing into medical technology that could save lives. It's about the charitable foundation we ran that provided healthcare to underserved communities. Emma felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. You're trying to guilt me into helping you. I'm trying to help you understand that sometimes we have to choose between our own comfort and doing what's right, William said. You became a nurse because you wanted to help people. This is another way to help people on a much larger scale. Emma stared at the envelope in William's hands. What would I have to do? Come with me to the courthouse at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Tell the judge what you witnessed last night. Help me prove that David is unfit to control the company he stole from me. And if I refuse, then David will probably succeed in having me committed again, and you'll still face the consequences of his anger. The only difference is that you'll face them alone, without any way to fight back. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible decision. Help a man she barely knew fight a battle she didn't understand, or face the wrath of a powerful enemy who had already demonstrated his willingness to destroy anyone who got in his way. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, William said. But Emma, I need to know by 8 a.m. tomorrow. The hearing starts at 9, and I can't do this without you. Emma nodded and turned to walk away, but William called her name. Emma, wait. She turned back to face him. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that meeting you has restored my faith in human nature. You showed kindness to a stranger when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. That matters more than you know. Emma walked home in a daze, her mind churning with everything she had learned. By the time she reached her apartment building, she had made her decision. She would help William, not because she understood the legal complexities or the business implications, but because she had seen the cruelty in David's eyes and heard the threats in his voice. She spent the rest of the morning researching everything she could find about Harrison Tech and the Harrison family. What she discovered made her stomach turn. David Harrison was already under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for suspected fraud. The company's stock price had dropped by 60% since he took control. And there were multiple lawsuits from former employees alleging wrongful termination and discrimination. At 8 a.m., Emma called William's number. I'll do it, she said when he answered. Thank you, William said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll pick you up at 8:30. I'll be ready. The courthouse was an imposing stone building downtown, with marble columns and brass fixtures that spoke of authority and tradition. Emma felt small and insignificant as she walked up the steps beside William, who was once again dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. Are you ready for this? William asked as they approached the security checkpoint. No, Emma said honestly. But I'm here. The hearing room was smaller than Emma had expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. David Harrison was already there, sitting at a table with 3 lawyers in identical dark suits. He looked confident, almost smug, as if the outcome was predetermined. His expression changed when he saw Emma walk in with his father. What is she doing here? David asked, rising from his chair. Ms. Thompson is here to testify, William's lawyer said. Emma was surprised to see that William had legal representation, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who looked like she could hold her own in any courtroom. Testify to what? David demanded. She has nothing to do with this case. She has everything to do with it, the lawyer replied. She's a witness to your behavior, your threats, demonstrated unfitness to hold a position of corporate responsibility. The judge, a stern-looking man in his 60s, called for order. This is a competency hearing to determine whether William Harrison Sr. is mentally fit to manage his own affairs. I'll hear testimony from both sides, but I won't tolerate any disruptions. For the next 2 hours, Emma listened to testimony from doctors, lawyers, and business associates. David's side presented evidence of William's supposedly erratic behavior, his disappearance from the psychiatric facility, his decision to live on the streets. They painted a picture of a man who had lost touch with reality and posed a danger to himself and others. William's lawyer countered with evidence of David's embezzlement, his forged documents, his abuse of power. She presented financial records showing how David had looted the company's assets, testimony from employees who had witnessed his cruelty and incompetence, and medical records proving that William had never been mentally ill. Finally, it was Emma's turn to testify. Ms. Thompson, William's lawyer said, please tell the court about your encounter with David Harrison 2 nights ago. Emma took a deep breath and began to speak. She described the confrontation in the hospital hallway, David's threats against her, his dismissive attitude toward her profession, and her worth as a person. She repeated his words verbatim, how he had called her nobody and threatened to make her life difficult for showing kindness to his father. And what was your impression of David Harrison's character based on this encounter? The lawyer asked. Emma looked directly at David, who was glaring at her with undisguised hatred. He was cruel, she said. He was the kind of person who enjoys having power over others, who sees people as objects to be used or discarded. He threatened me not because I had done anything wrong, but because I had shown kindness to someone he wanted to control. Objection, one of David's lawyers said. The witness is not qualified to make character assessments. Sustained, the judge said. Ms. Thompson, please stick to what you observed, not your interpretations. Emma nodded. I observed someone who was willing to threaten and intimidate a hospital worker for helping his father. Someone who seemed to enjoy causing fear and distress. Someone who spoke about destroying people's lives as if it was a normal part of doing business. David's lawyer cross-examined her for 20 minutes, trying to discredit her testimony by pointing out her financial problems, her lack of education compared to the other witnesses, her obvious bias in favor of William. But Emma held firm, repeating what she had seen and heard without embellishment or interpretation. When the testimony concluded, the judge retired to consider his decision. Emma sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, her hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. She had done what William asked, but she had no idea if it would be enough. 30 minutes later, the judge returned with his ruling. After considering all the evidence presented, he said, I find that William Harrison Sr. is mentally competent and capable of managing his own affairs. The previous ruling declaring him incompetent is hereby overturned. Furthermore, I am referring the evidence of financial fraud and abuse of power to the appropriate authorities for criminal investigation. Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was short-lived. David Harrison was on his feet, his face red with rage. This is a travesty, he shouted. My father is mentally ill. He's been living on the streets like a vagrant. He's not fit to run a company. Mr. Harrison, the judge said sternly, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Harrison from the courtroom. As David was led away, he turned to look at Emma one last time. The hatred in his eyes was so intense that she felt physically ill. This isn't over, he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom. This isn't over by a long shot. Outside the courthouse, William thanked Emma with tears in his eyes. You saved my life, he said. You gave me back my company, my future, my dignity. I'll never be able to repay you for what you've done. You don't need to repay me, Emma said. I just did what was right. No, William said firmly. You did what was brave. And brave people deserve to be rewarded for their courage. 1 week later, Emma was working the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital when she received a call from the hospital administrator. Ms. Thompson, could you come to my office, please? There's someone here who wants to speak with you. Emma's heart sank. She was sure it was David Harrison, or one of his lawyers, or someone else who wanted to make her life difficult for her role in the court case. She made her way to the administrator's office with a heavy heart. But when she opened the door, she found William Harrison sitting across from the administrator's desk, smiling broadly. Emma, he said, standing to greet her. I have some news. What kind of news? She asked cautiously. Good news, William said. The best kind. First, David has been arrested for embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of power. He's looking at 20 years in federal prison. Emma felt a surge of relief. And second, I've regained control of Harrison Tech. The board has voted to reinstate me as CEO, and our stock price has already recovered 30% of its losses. That's wonderful, Emma said, though she wasn't sure why the administrator had called her in to hear this news. And third, William continued, I've been thinking about what you said about wanting to help people, about the kind of nurse you want to be. I have a proposition for you. Emma felt her heart racing. What kind of proposition? Harrison Tech is expanding into medical technology. We're developing new equipment for hospitals, new treatments for diseases, new ways to improve patient care. I want you to head our new healthcare innovation division. Emma stared at him in disbelief. I don't know anything about running a division of a technology company. You know about patient care, William said. You know about the problems that nurses and doctors face every day. You know what it's like to work in a system that's underfunded and understaffed. That's exactly the kind of knowledge we need. What would the job pay? Emma asked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. $200,000 a year to start, William said, plus benefits, stock options, and a signing bonus to cover your student loans. Emma felt dizzy. $200,000? And that's just the beginning, William said. If you're successful, if you can help us develop technology that really makes a difference in people's lives, the sky's the limit. Emma looked at the hospital administrator, who was beaming with pride. This is incredible, Emma. Mr. Harrison has also agreed to donate $10 million to upgrade our medical equipment. There's one condition, William said. I want you to continue working here as a nurse, at least part-time. I want you to stay connected to the front lines of patient care, to never lose sight of why we're doing this work. Emma felt tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Williams said. Say yes to changing the world, to helping people on a scale you never imagined possible. Say yes to being rewarded for your kindness instead of punished for it. Emma thought about her tiny apartment, her crushing debt, her fear of David Harrison's revenge. She thought about the eviction notice that was still sitting on her kitchen table, about the patient relations course she was supposed to attend, about the reprimand in her file. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I'll do it. 6 months later, Emma stood in the boardroom of Harrison Tech, presenting the latest prototype of a diagnostic device that could detect cancer at its earliest stages. The technology she had helped develop was already being tested in hospitals around the world, and the initial results were promising. She had kept her word to William, continuing to work at St. Mary's Hospital 2 days a week, staying connected to the patients and nurses who had shaped her understanding of healthcare. Her student loans were paid off, she had moved into a beautiful apartment downtown, and she was making a difference in the lives of thousands of people. But the most satisfying moment came when she received word that David Harrison had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for his crimes. The judge had cited his callous disregard for human dignity and his willingness to destroy anyone who opposed him as factors in the harsh sentence. Emma had attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the gallery as David was led away in handcuffs. He had looked smaller somehow, diminished by the loss of his power and wealth. As he passed by her on his way to the door, he had stopped and looked at her with eyes that were no longer filled with hatred, but with something else entirely. You were right, he said quietly, about kindness being more valuable than money. I never understood that until I lost everything. Emma nodded, feeling no satisfaction in his downfall, only sadness for the man he could have been if he had chosen differently. As she left the courthouse that day, Emma reflected on the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. It had all started with a simple act of kindness, a $7 meal purchased for a stranger with money she couldn't afford to spend. That single act had changed her life in ways she never could have imagined. She had learned that kindness, far from being a weakness, was actually a form of strength. It had the power to transform lives, to reveal character, to create connections between people that transcended social and economic boundaries. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it had the power to change the world. Emma had thought she was just buying dinner for a homeless man. Instead, she had discovered that her capacity for compassion was worth more than any fortune, and that the greatest rewards in life came not from what you accumulated, but from what you gave away. The homeless man had turned out to be a billionaire, but the lesson he had taught her was priceless, that the measure of a person's worth wasn't found in their bank account, but in their willingness to help others when they had nothing to gain except the satisfaction of doing what was right. And that lesson, Emma knew, would guide her for the rest of her life.